The wagon had disappeared over the ridge an hour ago, but Enora still stood in the snow, watching the empty horizon where the wooden frame had vanished like a ghost into the gray December sky. Beside her, 7-year-old Celia pressed against her mother's skirt, her small hand clutching the worn fabric with a grip that had not loosened since her father had driven away. The wind swept across the Montana Territory plateau with a keening sound that seemed to voice all the things Enora could not say aloud, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the bitter certainty of survival's price. Silas had taken everything. The wagon with its canvas cover, patched but serviceable. The 2 horses, steady creatures who had pulled them across half a continent. The supplies meant to see them through to Oregon, the sacks of flour and beans, the salt pork, the tools, the rifle, the warm quilts Enora had stitched during their courtship. He'd left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single thin wool blanket that had been airing on a bush when he'd made his decision, and words that still burned in Enora's memory with the intensity of a brand. "I never wanted this life. Either of you. You were both mistakes I'm done paying for." He'd said it calmly, without particular malice, as if he were discussing the weather or the quality of the trail ahead. That had somehow made it worse. If he'd been angry, if he'd been drunk, if there had been any heat in his abandonment, Enora might have found a way to understand it. But his cold rationality, his matter-of-fact dismissal of his wife and child, cut deeper than rage ever could. The December sun hung low and pale, offering light but no warmth, a weak circle of white in a sky the color of old pewter. Enora looked down at her daughter's upturned face, those wide brown eyes full of questions that deserved better answers than the truth could provide. Celia had her father's dark hair but her mother's features, and Enora found herself grateful for that small mercy. She smoothed Celia's hair with fingers already stiff from the cold, forcing her frozen features into something resembling courage, something that might pass for confidence in a child's eyes. "We're going to be all right," Enora said. And in that moment, she made it true by speaking it aloud. The words hung in the air, crystallizing like her breath, and she repeated them with more force. "We're going to be all right, Celia. I promise you. Where did Papa go?" Celia's voice was small, uncertain, threading through the wind's howl. "Away," Enora said simply. There would be time for fuller explanations later, if they survived. "It's just us now, sweet girl. Just you and me." They had been traveling with Silas's wagon train for 2 days when he abandoned them, which meant they were perhaps 15 miles from the last settlement they'd passed through, and 30 or more from the next. The landscape stretched in all directions, an endless succession of snow-covered hills, dotted with stands of pine and skeletal cottonwoods. Walking back meant certain death in the elements. Enora knew they'd never make 15 miles through deep snow with no food and inadequate clothing. Walking forward offered the same cruel mathematics. But standing still was not in Enora's nature, had never been, not even when standing still might have been the wiser choice. She had noticed the dark mouth of the cave the previous evening, when they'd still been 3, husband, wife, and child, riding in the wagon together in the fiction of a family. It had been a shadow against the limestone cliff face about a mile to the north, half hidden by a stand of pines that seemed to guard its entrance. At the time, it had seemed merely a curiosity, one of the many geological features that marked this rugged territory. Now it represented possibility, perhaps the only possibility they had. "Can you walk a little further, sweet girl?" Enora asked, already calculating the distance, the time it would take, the remaining daylight. Celia nodded, though her lips had taken on a bluish tint that frightened Enora more than she'd let show. They set out across the snow, Enora carrying the blanket in one arm and Celia in the other, when the drifts grew too deep for the child's short legs. The little girl's body felt light with hunger and youth, a precious bundle that Enora held close to her own body for warmth. The wind pushed against them, as if testing their resolve, and Enora pushed back, leaning into it with each step. The trek took nearly an hour. By the time they reached the cliff face, Enora's arms ached and her lungs burned from the cold air. But they'd made it, and the cave entrance stood before them like an open mouth, darker and more promising than it had appeared from a distance. The cave entrance stood taller than Enora had estimated, perhaps 8 feet high and equally wide. She set Celia down and peered into the darkness. The space extended back into the hillside, the ceiling rising to accommodate what appeared to be a substantial chamber. The ground inside was dry, scattered with old leaves and the bones of small animals. No fresh tracks, no smell of bear or cat. The cave had been empty for some time. "Is this where we'll stay?" Celia asked, her voice small against the wind's howl. "Yes," Enora said. "This is where we'll make our home." That first night, they huddled together beneath the single blanket, listening to the wind shriek past the cave entrance. Enora did not sleep. She planned. When morning light filtered into the cave, Enora rose with purpose. She had been a farmer's daughter before she'd been Silas's wife, and her father had taught her that survival was simply a series of small, practical decisions made one after another until you found yourself on the other side of hardship. "We need a fire," she told Celia. "Can you help me gather kindling?" The woods surrounding the cliff face provided dead branches and bark. Enora's fingers, already cracked from cold, bled as she stripped birch bark and snapped twigs. Celia dragged larger branches through the snow, her small face set with determination. Together, they built a pile near the cave entrance where the smoke could escape. Fire proved to be the greatest challenge of those first days. Enora had no flint, no steel, no matches. She'd watched her father make fire by friction once, years ago, when she was barely older than Celia was now. He'd made it look simple, almost effortless, the way skilled people do with tasks they've mastered. But Enora had never tried it herself, had never needed to, and now the knowledge felt like something seen through fog, present but indistinct. She gathered the driest wood she could find, blessed that the cave had sheltered some fallen branches from the snow. She needed a fireboard and a spindle. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The wood had to be right, not too hard, not too soft. Cedar was best, or cottonwood. She settled on a piece of dead cottonwood that felt promising, its bark already peeling away. For hours she worked. She carved a small depression in the fireboard with a sharp stone, then began rotating the spindle between her palms, pressing down to create friction. Her hands moved up the spindle with each rotation, then slid quickly back to the top to begin again, over and over, faster and faster. The motion looked simple. The reality was agonizing. Her palms blistered within the first hour. The blisters broke. Her hands bled, the blood mixing with wood dust and her own sweat despite the cold. Celia watched with absolute faith, never doubting that her mother would succeed, and that faith was both a comfort and a burden. What if she couldn't do this? What if they froze because she lacked this one essential skill? "Tell me about the farm, Mama," Celia said softly. "Tell me about when you were little." So Enora talked while she worked, her voice keeping rhythm with her hands. She spoke of summers in Ohio, of her father's fields of corn growing tall and green, of her mother's kitchen garden bursting with tomatoes and beans. She described the cool spring house where they kept milk and butter, the hen house where she'd gathered eggs each morning, the barn cat who'd had endless litters of kittens that she and her sisters had named and adored. She talked, and her hands moved, and the spindle spun. And slowly, so slowly, the wood grew warm. After what felt like an eternity, a wisp of smoke curled upward from the depression in the fireboard. Enora's heart leaped, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. She kept the spindle rotating, kept the pressure steady until a small coal glowed red in the wood dust that had accumulated. With shaking, bloodied hands, she carefully transferred the coal to a nest of shredded bark and dried grass she'd prepared. She brought the nest close to her face and blew gently, steadily, tears streaming down her face from the smoke and from relief and from sheer emotional exhaustion. The grass smoldered, then smoked more heavily. A tiny flame licked at the bark, then another, and then, miraculous and ancient, fire bloomed in her hands. Celia clapped her small hands together, a sound like bird wings in the cave's quiet. Enora carefully, reverently, transferred the burning nest to the pile of kindling they'd gathered. She fed it carefully, adding larger pieces as the flames grew stronger. Within minutes, they had a real fire, crackling and warm, pushing back the shadows and the cold. Enora sat back on her heels and wept. Not delicate tears, but great, gulping sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the marriage that had failed, for the man who'd abandoned his family, for the terror of the last 2 days, for the pain in her hands and the cold in her bones. And she cried with relief and pride, because she'd done this impossible thing, had brought fire into being with nothing but wood and determination. Celia crawled into her mother's lap, and together they sat before the flames, absorbing heat and light and hope. They had fire. Over the next days, Enora worked with methodical intensity to seal the cave entrance against the wind without blocking light and smoke ventilation. Using branches Celia dragged in, she constructed a framework across the cave mouth, weaving smaller branches between them in a rough lattice. Into the gaps, she stuffed dried grass, leaves, and pine needles. "It's like a wall," Celia said, watching her mother work. "It's better than a wall," Enora replied, tying another branch into place with strips torn from her dress hem. "It breathes." Water came from snow melted in a flat stone they'd found in the cave, heated near the fire until it steamed and they could drink it warm. It tasted of stone and smoke, but it was clean, and it was theirs. Food was a more difficult problem, one that consumed Enora's thoughts during every waking moment of those first weeks. She'd never trapped before, never needed to, but necessity proved to be an excellent teacher. She studied the snow around the cave entrance with new eyes, learning to read the story it told. Rabbit tracks were everywhere, small prints in pairs, hopping patterns that led to and from holes in the earth where the creatures sheltered. There were fox tracks too, larger and more deliberate, and once she saw the enormous splayed prints of a mountain lion. That discovery made her heart race and her priorities shift. She needed to protect Celia, needed to make them less vulnerable. The snares came from the brass wire stays of her corset, pried free with bleeding fingers and shaped into loops. She'd watched her father set snares for rabbits when times were lean, remembered the basic principle. A loop suspended in a run, triggered by the animal's movement. But remembering and doing proved to be very different things. Her first 3 snares caught nothing. The 4th caught and lost a rabbit. She found the sprung snare with tufts of gray fur in the loop, evidence of her near success. The 5th caught a young rabbit solidly, and Enora killed it quickly, whispering an apology to the small creature that would let them live another few days. She'd never skinned an animal before, had never even watched closely when her father or brothers did it. But she'd seen it done, and she had no choice but to try. The work was harder than she'd imagined, messier, more intimate. By the time she finished, her hands were covered in blood, and her dress was ruined beyond repair. But she had meat, precious, life-sustaining meat, and a pelt that would provide some small measure of warmth. She showed Celia how to read the tracks, crouching beside her daughter in the snow and pointing out the details that mattered. See how the back prints land ahead of the front prints? That's how you know it's a rabbit. They hop, so their stronger back legs push them forward and land first. And see how the prints lead from this brush pile to that tree? That's a run. Rabbits use the same paths over and over, like we use roads. They feel safer on familiar ground. Celia absorbed everything with a seriousness beyond her years. She asked questions that showed real understanding. If they use the same paths, won't they learn to avoid our snares? Enora had to admit she didn't know, but together they developed strategies, moving snares frequently, setting them in different positions along the runs, using small amounts of what little food they had to create bait stations that drew the rabbits to new locations. The first rabbit was followed by a second, then a third. Enora learned to be more efficient with the skinning, wasting less meat, damaging the pelts less. She discovered that rabbit organs, while not pleasant to eat, were edible and surprisingly nourishing. The bones, roasted until they were brittle, could be crushed and added to hot water to make a thin but strengthening broth. Nothing could be wasted, not even the smallest scrap. She made needles from the bones, smoothing them with stones and piercing eyes with the tip of her knife, the one implement she'd had in her pocket when Silas left, and thus the one tool they owned. She made thread from sinew, painstakingly separating the fibers and twisting them together. Her stitches were crude at first, large and uneven, but they held. She sewed the rabbit pelts together edge to edge, creating a growing fur blanket that trapped heat far better than their single wool one. "You're clever, Mama," Celia said one evening, watching Enora work by firelight. "I'm desperate," Enora corrected, then smiled to soften the words. "But thank you, sweet girl. Necessity makes us all clever." As days became weeks and the cave slowly transformed from mere shelter into something approaching a home, Enora developed systems for everything. She built a raised sleeping platform from branches lashed together with sinew, lifting their bed off the cold floor where the temperature dropped most severely at night. The construction took 3 days and left her with sore muscles and new calluses on top of old blisters. But when she and Celia slept on it that first night, elevated and insulated, the difference was remarkable. She wove mats from dried grass and pine needles, creating insulation beneath the blanket that now covered a bed frame of lashed branches. The rabbit pelts accumulated, and she stitched them together with sinew and bone needles, creating a second blanket that smelled wild but held heat like a blessing. The cave walls themselves became functional. Enora discovered that the limestone was soft enough to carve with harder stones, and she created niches in the rock face for storing their meager possessions, the bone tools, the few roots and nuts they'd scavenged, the supply of tinder kept dry for the fire. Celia proved an able assistant. She learned to tend the fire, adding wood in small amounts to keep it burning steady. She helped scrape the rabbit hides, her small fingers working the skins until they were supple. She collected pine pitch that Enora used to waterproof their wind barrier and seal cracks in the stone. The child who had once been sheltered and protected was becoming self-reliant. capable, strong. "Mama," Celia said one evening as they sat by the fire, "are we poor?" Enora looked around their cave. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Their bed platform was sturdy, covered with grass mats and fur. Stone niches held their carefully organized supplies. The wind barrier kept out the worst of the cold. Outside, snow fell in heavy curtains, but inside, they were warm and fed. "No, sweet girl," Enora said. "We're not poor. We're rich in what matters." As winter deepened, Enora expanded their survival systems. She dug a cold storage pit at the back of the cave, where the temperature remained just above freezing. Here she stored snow-packed meat from the rabbits she caught with increasing regularity. She made a drying rack near the fire for preserving meat and any edible plants she could find. The ceiling of the cave became a repository of hanging bundles, dried grasses, medicinal herbs she recognized from her childhood, strips of meat curing in the smoke. She carved a channel in the floor to direct water seepage away from their living area, leading it to a depression that served as a catch basin. Celia learned to read the weather by watching the smoke from their fire. When it rose straight and steady, the weather would hold. When it swirled and pushed back into the cave, a storm was coming. She learned to identify animal tracks in the snow, distinguishing rabbit from squirrel from fox. She learned which stones would spark against each other, which wood burned hot and which burned long, which plants could be eaten and which should be avoided. "You're becoming a mountain woman," Enora told her daughter one morning, watching Celia efficiently reset a snare. "Is that what we are now?" Celia asked. "Mountain women?" "I suppose it is," Enora said. "We're whatever we need to be." The hardest times came during the deepest cold, when temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid even inside the cave, and their breath hung in visible clouds. Enora would pull Celia close, wrapping them both in the rabbit fur blanket, and tell stories. She spoke of her childhood on the farm, of seasons and harvest, of how the world would look when spring came. She told fairy tales and fables, adventures and romances, anything to pass the frozen hours. Celia told stories too, inventing elaborate tales of the animals they tracked, giving them names and families. The rabbit they'd caught became Lord Thistlewhisker, a noble creature. The fox whose tracks they'd seen became Lady Redbrush, elegant and cunning. On Christmas Eve, Enora carved a small figure from pine wood, a rough angel with outstretched wings. She placed it in one of the wall niches, and together, she and Celia sang every carol they could remember. Their voices echoed off the stone walls, and for a moment, the cave felt like a church, sacred and safe. "I miss Papa," Celia said quietly after the singing stopped. Enora pulled her daughter close. She would not lie. "I know you do, sweet girl. Will he come back?" "No," Enora said, "but we don't need him to. We have each other, and we have this." She gestured around the cave at everything they'd built. "We made this ourselves." January brought the worst of the winter. Snow piled 6 feet deep outside the cave entrance, and for 3 days they couldn't leave their shelter. Enora worried about their meat supply, about the snares buried under snow, about whether they had enough firewood. But she didn't let Celia see her fear. Instead, they played games, made shadow puppets on the cave wall, practiced arithmetic using pebbles. Enora taught Celia to read using the small Bible that had been in her pocket when Silas left. They read Genesis, and the story of creation and new beginnings seemed appropriate. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find their world transformed into fantastic shapes of snow and ice. 3 of their snares had survived, and by afternoon they had fresh meat. Enora began to think beyond simple survival. She used charcoal from the fire to draw on the cave walls, sketching plans. A better door for the entrance, a proper chimney to direct smoke, storage shelves, a table and chairs, carved from logs when the weather warmed. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Celia asked, watching her mother draw. "I don't know about forever," Enora said, "but we'll stay as long as we need to. This is our home now." And it was a home. Enora had created order from chaos, shelter from exposure, safety from abandonment. Every improvement to the cave was an act of defiance against Silas's cruelty, against the winter's rage, against a world that had deemed them dispensable. The cave had become a testament to what a determined woman and her daughter could accomplish when survival demanded it. February brought subtle signs of coming change. The sun rose slightly earlier each day, setting slightly later. The snow, while still deep, developed a crust that could sometimes bear their weight. Enora ventured further from the cave, checking trap lines she'd extended into the surrounding forest. She found a frozen stream and marked its location, knowing it would mean fresh water once the thaw came. One afternoon, Celia discovered something remarkable. At the very back of the cave, where the ceiling lowered and the darkness became absolute, she found what appeared to be ancient drawings on the stone. Handprints in red ochre, figures of animals, symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. "Mama, come look," she called, and Enora crawled back to see. They studied the drawings by the light of a torch made from pine pitch and dried grass. Someone had lived here before them, or at least sheltered here. Someone had survived in this place and left their mark. "We should add ours too," Celia said. So Enora mixed charcoal with rendered rabbit fat, creating a dark pigment. She traced Celia's hand on the wall near the ancient marks, then her own hand beside it. Below, she scratched with a sharp stone. Enora and Celia, winter 1882 to 1883. We survived. As March arrived, the cave had become a surprisingly comfortable dwelling. The sleeping platform was piled with furs and dried grass, actually soft enough to sleep well upon. The fire circle was lined with stones that radiated heat long after the flames died down. Enora had made clay vessels from mud she'd found in a sheltered ravine, firing them in the coals, crude but functional pots for cooking and storage. They had established routines. Morning meant banking the fire and checking the weather. If conditions allowed, they checked trap lines and gathered firewood. Afternoon meant preparing food, working on improvements to the cave, and lessons, reading, arithmetic, storytelling. Evening meant tending the fire, preparing for the night, and the quiet companionship of a mother and daughter who had learned to depend on each other absolutely. "I think spring is coming," Celia said one morning, standing at the cave entrance. "Listen." Enora joined her and heard it, the drip of melting snow, the first she'd heard in months. It was a small sound, but it carried the weight of promise. "Yes," she agreed. "Spring is coming. What will we do when it comes?" It was the question Enora had been avoiding. Spring meant possibility. It meant they could travel, seek out a settlement, rejoin civilization. It also meant leaving this place they'd built, this cave that had sheltered them through the worst winter of their lives. "We have choices now," Enora said carefully. "We could go to a town, find work. I could take in sewing or washing. You could go to school." "But we could stay too," Celia said. "Couldn't we?" Enora looked around their cave home. She thought of the garden she could plant in the clearing outside come spring, the berry bushes she'd identified in the forest, now dormant but ready to fruit, the stream that would run fresh and clear once the ice melted. She thought of the life they could build here, unconventional but free, hard but honest. Yes, she said, we could stay too. As winter's grip finally loosened, Enora made her decision. They would remain through spring and summer, building a better shelter, establishing a garden, preparing properly for the next winter. If by autumn they wanted to leave, they could. But this place had saved them, and there was dignity in staying, in choosing the life they'd built, rather than returning to a world that had cast them aside. She began planning their summer projects, a proper door, a garden plot, perhaps even a small lean-to shelter for expanded storage. She would need tools, which meant a trip to a settlement eventually, but they could trade furs and perhaps wild herbs for what they needed. They didn't need much. The last snow fell on a night in late March. Enora and Celia stood at the cave entrance, watching the flakes drift down in the firelight's glow. Behind them, the cave was warm and organized, every item in its place, every corner serving a purpose. They had transformed a hole in the rock into a home, and in doing so, had transformed themselves. "I'm glad he left us," Celia said suddenly, and Enora drew in a sharp breath. "Sweet girl." "I am," Celia insisted. "If he hadn't left us, we wouldn't have found this place. We wouldn't have learned all the things we learned. We wouldn't know how strong we are." Enora knelt beside her daughter, looking into eyes that held more wisdom than 7 years should contain. "You're right," she said. "We wouldn't know." That night, they slept peacefully in their fur-covered bed, the fire burning low and steady, the wind a distant whisper beyond their carefully constructed barrier. Outside, winter was dying. Inside, 2 mountain women rested, secure in the home they'd made and the strength they'd discovered. Spring would bring new challenges, new decisions, new adventures. But they had survived the winter, not merely by enduring, but by building, creating, and thriving. The cave at Crow's Peak would stand long after they were gone, their handprints on the wall beside those of ancestors unknown, a testament to the human capacity for resilience, adaptation, and hope. In the morning, there would be work to do. But tonight, Enora and Celia simply existed in the space they'd claimed, transformed, and made their own. They had been abandoned, left to die in the winter wilderness. Instead, they had lived, and that, Enora thought as sleep finally claimed her, made all the difference.